Welcome everybody to the 2016 Minnesota lecture. I don't know how long the Minnesota lecture has been going on, but it is a lecture that we have every year. We take a committee of graduate students, and they get a list of all of our incredibly distinguished PhD alums and choose one.
This year you chose the best looking, I understand.
Yes. This year, they chose...
You're throwing stones, Charlotte?
Yeah. Art Rolnick, Senior Fellow at the Hubert Humphrey School of Public Affairs. And my introduction is as follows. Art's had I would say an amazing career, but actually he's kind of had three amazing careers. The first career I would talk about is the Fed. Art completely revolutionized how research departments at Feds work. He made it so that, when you're in academia, you spend a certain percentage of your time teaching, a certain percentage of your time doing research. And he said, but that research you do whatever the heck you want. That's the rules of the game for academia. He brought that in and said, we're going to do the same thing at the Fed. You're going to spend a certain amount of your time doing Fed stuff, and the rest doing completely self-directed research. Just go make yourself famous, which is what we tell professors to do. I just want to make a list of the people that Art personally hired at the Minneapolis Fed. And people said, oh, you're not going to do that. It'll take 10 minutes. But I'll read quickly. Andy Atkinson, Larry Cristiano, Jose Victor Rios Rule, Rayao Agari, Hal Cole, Tony Braun, Narayana Kotra Lakota, Monica Piazzesi, Martin Schneider, Virgilio Midrigan, Paco Buera, Leo Hanian, Pete Clino, Jeremy Greenwood, Steve Williamson, Urban German, Richard Rogerson, Bob Litterman. So far I haven't gotten to anyone who's still there. All right, the people, and if I get anyone wrong who's still there, it's because I got their date of hire wrong. Jim Smits, Juan Pablo Nicolini, Christina Ariano, Ed Prescott.
Ed who?
Prescott. In this department alone, Art was responsible for hiring Vivi Chari, Tom Holmes, Ellen McGrattan, Patrick Kehoe, and most importantly, me.
Can't get them all right.
What he did show, and I think this is a big thing to show, is it doesn't need to, this kind of managerial job doesn't need to take all your time. Art had a distinguished career academically while there. He worked on monetary history, whether or not it makes sense to have billion-dollar stadiums built in between here and the Fed, and more recently has focused, so this is what I'm calling his third career, the importance of early childhood education. So we're extremely honored and thrilled to have, as our 2016 Minnesota lecturer, Art Rolnick.
Thank you. So it's quite an honor for me to be here. I came here in 1967 from Detroit, Michigan, as a student of economics. My professor there was a recent graduate from Minnesota. Studied under John Chipman, and he convinced me that I needed to go to a terrific school, and it was the University of Minnesota. It was an easy choice in some ways because it was either Vietnam or graduate school. I knew I was pretty lucky as soon as I landed because I knew Walter Heller was here. And as many of you know, Walter was John F. Kennedy's chief economic advisor. But what I didn't realize is the incredible talent that I was being exposed to and how lucky I was to be here. So I have this deep fondness for this department, and I'm, again, thrilled to be able to kind of reflect with you a little bit of my history and the history of this department and the bank, the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. So again, I came here in '67. I went to the bank in 1970, got my PhD in '73. Became the research director in 1985 and helped with some incredible people around me to build what turned out to be one of the best economic research departments in the world. It couldn't have happened without the University of Minnesota. I mean, we're close by. I kind of leveraged the existing resources here and created this partnership and got the Fed thinking that, look, public policy, good public policy needs to be based on the best research we have, and that that was the model. Let's bring the top people that we have, especially here in Minnesota, partner with the research department and make it happen. So it was easy in some ways. So when I started at the bank in '67, shortly after that, a guy close to my age, Neil Wallace, brings over to the bank, brings over to the University of Minnesota, a fellow by the name of Tom Sargent. And he was so intimidating, Sargent, because he was writing a JPEAE, our paper, virtually every week. And then he decides that he needs to improve on his mathematical skills. So he decides to take a course here at the U. By the end of the course, he's teaching the course, okay? He's writing papers faster than we can read them. And then when you had Wallace and Sargent together and you listened to these guys debate, well, you couldn't get a much better environment than that. So it was easy for me to think about, well, Tom and Neil were at the bank. They were advisors. We didn't have much of a research department at the time, but boy, probably be pretty easy to entice some people to come over to the bank and build on that relationship, on the relationship that we already started with Tom and Neil. And they also set the tone. You know, I'd like to take credit for all this stuff, but if you're around Tom and Neil, these guys were open to ideas. They interacted with people on a regular basis. They were just pushing good ideas and good research. So that was the model. It was pretty simple. If we're going to make good policy, let's bring as many people like that. And as you can imagine, there's all kinds of spillover effects when you have people like that around. And that's how we basically built that department. And as Chris mentioned, it ended up when we turned out some of the best economists in the world came through the University of Minnesota and the bank. And in a way that the two are one and the same. I mean, when certain people started at the bank, then they came to the U, and they were advisors at the bank, and vice versa. So that was the environment, and I'm needless to say, very proud of it. I retired from the bank in 2010, came back to the U, and decided that I wanted to be at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. And I'll explain this in more detail, but the work I was doing on early childhood education had a major political component to it. And I felt I needed to be in a school of public affairs that didn't just do research, but was responsible to reach out to the community, to reach out to the political system, and get that research into public policy. So that's why I went to Humphrey, set up an institute there that promotes early childhood education research and outreach. So that's where I am now. And through all this, lots of people have influenced me. I probably learned more economics from Neil Wallace than anybody else. Just sitting next to Neil, kind of absorb his ideas was one of the best educations I've had over the years. But when I first came here, I took a course from Walter Heller, a public finance course, which was co-taught with Ed Foster. And it's that course in so many ways that influenced my career. So I want to talk about what I titled this talk, The Economist and Public Policy, the Heller Legacy. So who is Walter Heller? So you may know this, but he got his PhD from Wisconsin. He joined the University of Minnesota in '46. He went on to become the chairman of President Kennedy's Economic Council, one of the leading economists in the 1960s. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine twice, in March of '61 and June of '22. And if you go to Heller Hall, where the economics department used to be, and you go on the main floor there across the elevators, you will see the front page of Time magazine and Walter Heller. He was famous for what was called the 1963 tax cut. And what many people don't know, he was also famous for getting involved in what Lyndon Johnson started as the War on Poverty. And that was the beginning of Head Start, which is an interesting connection for me. So the Heller legacy, what do I mean by that? So I'm going to give you my perspective. I'm sure, you know, Heller taught these huge undergraduate classes of hundreds of students, and I'm sure if you go around the Twin Cities to people that have taken this course, they talk about his class, and they might have a different interpretation of his legacy. So this is my interpretation of Heller's public policy legacy, and it's three parts, essentially. One, to contribute to public policy, as I already said, it must be based on solid research, all right? Research is key here. This is what we're brought up to think about, doing good research. Well, not all, in fact, very little research actually ends up in improving policy, but it's critical to improve policy, have it based on research. But it's not enough to do the policy, according to Heller and the way Heller taught it. You need to contribute, but you need to influence. So what do I mean by influencing? So if you're just writing academic papers and I'm just sitting here debating with Chari, that doesn't do it. You've got to translate it and get it out to the real world. You have to translate it so that policymakers can understand the basic ideas and why research suggests this is the right way to think about policy. So to contribute takes research, to influence takes translation, and then something that Heller touched on but never taught us, and that is if you really want to succeed, you've got to somehow, economists somehow, what I call navigate the political waters. And we're not taught that in graduate school. So now Heller's influence on me was kind of this is what I wanted to do with economics. I wanted to make a difference, if you will. And I didn't know how I was going to do that, but these were kind of his legacy for me. That's what I had to think about. And as I reflect specifically, particularly on my career at the Federal Reserve Bank, that was my job. Okay, so the way I want to convey this to you, to illustrate the legacy through my lens, I want to do this sort of a Harvard Business School thing. I want to do case studies. I want to talk about 3 major issues, and Chris talked on, that I was involved in, and have aspects of this legacy. So the first one, actually Chris didn't mention this, the first one was too big to fail. I'm sure you're all familiar with too big to fail and the issues involved with the financial crisis that led to the Great Recession here. So I want to do when I say a case study, I'm going to talk about how I got involved in that issue, and again, kind of go through the research part of it, and the translation part, and the political part. Case 2 is something that Chris did mention, what we dubbed the economic bidding war among the states. This is when cities and states try to lure each other's businesses across state lines, when particular companies, the sports teams are very good at this. Essentially, it's a form of economic blackmail. If you don't build me a stadium, I'm leaving. You can see the results of this economic bidding war close by. And then the third case study I want to talk about is what I'm working on now, and that is the economics of early childhood education. And again, talk about the underlying research, which is really powerful, and talk about the translation of that research and how we get that idea across. And then I'll finish this lecture with a discussion of the political issues. And as naive as I was when I first got into this area, I thought, well, once we have the research and translate it, we're done. But it's so interesting what the political headwinds are preventing us from fully funding, which I've argued, and no one yet has called me on it, is the best public investment we can make today, and that is high quality early childhood education starting as early as birth for our most at-risk kids. Okay, so the case studies. Let me start with too big to fail. I start with that because a not so well-known paper, at least not well-known outside the Minneapolis Fed, was a paper by John Carrican and Neil Wallace. It was titled Deposit Insurance and Bank Regulation, a Partial Equilibrium. And the theory they developed, they called it a partial equilibrium because they didn't have a theory of banks in 1979. And some of us would argue by 1983, Diamond and Didvig had what some of us would call the best theory we have of banks right now. But they didn't have that, so that's why they called it a partial equilibrium. Banks were just given. But in that model, they basically looked at deposit insurance and the type of incentives it created, moral hazard it created. And they pointed out that you got to be careful because if you provide this kind of insurance, there's an incentive to take a lot of risk, typical of insurance. And that, in particular, you better make sure you're regulating these banks to not take that kind of risk, or at least minimize banks going to the corner and maximizing the risk and maximizing essentially the deposit insurance subsidy. Because remember, deposit insurance is not priced, it's a flat rate. So that was a piece that appeared in the Journal of Business in 1978. I said 79, it was 1978. Shortly after that, in what publication that we used to have at the Minneapolis Fed called the Quarterly Review, Jack Harrigan published a paper, and this is sort of the translation, if you will. Deposit insurance reform or deregulation is the cart, not the horse. A little confusing, but what Jack meant about don't put the cart before the horse, at the time they were deregulating banks, but they weren't reforming deposit insurance. And his concern, based on their paper in 78, was that if you deregulate these banks, but you keep this insurance, it sort of heads the bank wins and tails the taxpayer loses. And they're going to take that bet every time. So in a way that was, the QR, the Quarterly Review, was an attempt to translate research. I don't think we did a very good job with it, by the way, but that was an attempt. Shortly after that, as you may know, there was a major bank financial crisis, known as the S&L crisis mostly, although many banks failed too. There was a classic case known as a fellow by the name of Charles Keating. Charles Keating ran an S&L. He bought it for about $50 million, and with a few years he had built it up to about a $2 billion bank. And he started investing, or S&L, and he started investing in building a city in the middle of a desert in Texas and in Arizona. He built this incredible hotel, which his accountant said there's no way you could, this thing was going to cash flow, that this thing could make money. He said, don't worry about it. But he was using essentially taxpayers' money. He went belly up big time. And by the way, politically it was interesting because he, known as the Keating Five, there were a number of senators who were lobbying the regulators to leave him alone. They were putting a good word in for him. But basically he was betting the bank, if you will, doing exactly what Carrick and Wallace had predicted in their paper in 78, 79, and what Jack had written in the Quarterly Review. You're letting these S&Ls, you're deregulating them and letting them get into high-risk ventures, which they're going to do because if it had worked out, he would have been Banker of the Year. It didn't. Failed big time, and the taxpayer. And he wasn't the only. We had literally hundreds of S&Ls fail. They were building what they used to call skyscrapers, see-through skyscrapers. They were building them sort of with the anticipation that they would make a profit on them, but the due diligence was pretty weak, and most of these ventures, high risk, potential high return, but they failed. And so the S&L industry generally went under and got this big bailout. It's unusual, I think, in economics to have a paper that was that prescient, if you will, that anticipated this problem and laid out the theory pretty clearly. Where I think it failed is that we didn't do a very good job translating it, and we weren't in the political arena at all on that issue. However, in 1991, Congress, based on what went on in the 80s, this collapse of the S&L industry, and about roughly 1,000 banks failed over that same time period, Congress passed something known as the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation Act, FDICA. And they were kind of aware of this work that we had done at the Minneapolis Fed, warning about, be careful about deregulating banks. So their idea was the following. They passed into law that the regulators would close these financial institutions down before their capital went negative, so there wouldn't be any loss. So the idea was the regulators, and the Fed was part of this. We examined the banks, every 6 months, every year, depending on the bank size. We would anticipate, we would see when the capital is getting too low, and we'd shut that bank down. Now, at the Minneapolis Fed, we were very skeptical that regulators could do that. It would take a lot of political clout, if you will, to go into a bank, tell the bank that their strategy is too risky and we're closing you down now because your capital is close to zero. Very difficult, actually, to measure capital. It moves around pretty quickly. So we started to raise some questions about FDICA, and we said, we actually published, and this was more of a translation with a fellow named Ron Feldman, who is a senior VP today and over supervision at the Minneapolis Fed. Feldman and I wrote this piece, Fixing Felicia. We published this in 97 in our annual report, and it was titled Fixing Felicia, A Plan to Address the Too Big to Fail Problem. So this is in 1997. We're already saying that there are banks there, exactly what Carrick and Wallace worried about, banks that were considered too big to fail, that if they got in trouble, we're going to have to bail them out because if they fail, there's all these spillover effects. And it was pretty well known who these banks were that were too big to fail, so there wasn't a surprise. So they have all these incentives to do exactly what Jack and Neil said in their 79 paper, to go to the corner and take a lot of risks. So Ron and I published that paper, and we started to meet with some people in some of the governors and the Federal Reserve governors in Washington. And the first response we got from that is, well, you guys in Minneapolis, this may be good economic theory, but in the real world, we know these bankers, and they wouldn't do that. That was the response we got. We had a dinner with one of the governors who was a former banker, and he said, oh, we just wouldn't do that. So fast forward a few more years, and the president of our bank, Gary Stern, and Feldman wrote a book in 2004. So remember, the financial crisis hits in 2008. 2004, too big to fail. It's on record. It was published in 2004, and it kind of went through a lot of this history, that the research that we had done, and the S&L crisis and all this, and suggestions for doing something now in 2004. Bank capital was pretty strong. This would have been a good time, as banks were doing well to fix this problem of too big to fail and moral hazard. Mr. Greenspan, who was chairman of the Fed at the time, told, again, we got the same response. You guys in Minneapolis, you're not in New York. You're not in Chicago. We talk to these bankers all the time, and that's just not going to happen. And Mr. Geithner, who was president of the New York Fed, whose job it is, as well as Greenspan's, to make sure that our banking system is safe and sound. Again, the response to us was, bankers wouldn't do this. Why would they take all that kind of risk? And I said, all the incentives are there for them to take that kind of risk. And it may not be the CEO. Who knows if the CEO knows what's going on in that company? But clearly, there's the incentive to do this. So, in 09 and 010, after the crisis happened, Gary Stern was on a panel with Mr. Greenspan, and Mr. Greenspan actually apologized for not listening at the time. So I want to say about this particular issue, the research was there, as Walter would say, you need the good research. We did translate it in a lot of ways. We got into the political arena, but we failed. We didn't do a very good job on the last part, on the political part. Again, we're not taught that in graduate school. Powers to be are, you could see where people are a little reluctant to buy what some economist might have to say. So you can influence in a way, and we clearly influenced the discussion, but on too big to fail. The political process was, difficult for us to overcome. So that's case study one, too big to fail. So case study two, something called we call the economic war among the states. I'll give you a little background on how I got involved in this one. I was on the Star Tribune, the local newspaper here. They used to have a board of economists, and we would invite a CEO or somebody who's got some issue, which you thought was a pretty good economics issue. We would invite to the board and have them talk about the issue. Well, it was 1991, and it was Northwest Airlines before it was Delta. It was Northwest Airlines, and we had the CEO there, a man by the name of Al Checky. And Al Checky is proposed the following. If the state of Minnesota would lend to Northwest Airlines, they were talking about $500 million at a very low interest rate relative to the market. It was like, at that time, market rates were very high, and they were asking the state for a 7% loan. And when I looked at their bonds, they were considered junk bonds, and they were going at about 18%. And so Mr. Checky was looking for this $500 million loan, and the quid pro quo was if Minnesota gave Northwest Airlines this loan, they would create jobs up in the Iron Range, which was, and as it is still, a depressed area. And so politically, you could see why you might get politicians looking at this. But I raised my hand and say, why, if the market's not going to fund you at 7%, at 18%, why should the state take that kind of risk? And well, they said, because we're going to create all these jobs. But implicit in that discussion was their hub, their headquarters are here in Minneapolis, their major hub. They have 15,000 Northwest Airlines jobs. And by the way, Minnesota, if you don't give us this money, we're going to go to Detroit or Memphis and put our corporate headquarters there, and those 15,000 jobs leave. Now, you're the governor of the state. This kind of economic blackmail is hard to turn down, and they didn't. And they got didn't get all that they asked for, but they got quite a bit. And these jobs, once they got their money, and they ended up getting about $330 million, these low interest rate loans. And shortly after that, they said, well, you know, we really don't need that maintenance facility. That was what they were going to put, a maintenance facility up north, which made no economic sense, by the way. You don't put a maintenance facility in a cold weather climate. You know, it made no economic sense. So they started to say, we really don't need. After they got their loan, they started to back out. But Congressman Obastar had a fit. And what they ended up doing is they put a conference center in there, a conference call center. So it was a bunch of low-paying jobs. It wasn't 2,000 high-paying jobs that they promised. Anyways, it all went down. And then I started to dig into this a little deeper, and I knew the governor at the time, and the governor kind of explained to me that, listen, this wasn't just about the 2,000 jobs. It was about the threat that they would leave. And once I realized it was a threat that they would leave, I stopped being critical of the governor. I started asking questions. And the general counsel at the bank was a fellow named Mel Burstein, and I said, Mel, this looks like an interference in interstate commerce to me, because there's this underlying threat that they're going to move. We have a commerce clause in our Constitution that says cities and states, actually called the Dormant Commerce Clause, cities and states aren't supposed to be interfering with interstate commerce. I said, so Mel, shouldn't this be an issue, a serious legal issue? He looked at me and says, Rolnick, you economists are always telling me that competition is good. So why isn't this a good kind of competition between states? So the two of us are babbling back and forth on the law and the economics, and I go back and I realize there is a famous piece by Thibault that appeared, I think, in '56 in JPE that talked about what I'll say is the good competition between cities and states. And the good competition is when cities and states are battling who's going to produce the best public goods at the lowest price. And then people can vote with their feet. You want to come to Minnesota, high taxes, good schools, or you want to go to Mississippi, low taxes, bad schools. And what Thibault argued was, by people voting with their feet, it's a way of helping cities and states solve their public goods problem. So that was a good competition. But the bad competition, the competition we questioned, was preferential, when you're picking winners and losers. And with the help of Tom Holmes and some of the work that he did, we were able to argue that from a national perspective, this is a zero-sum game. These businesses are going to locate somewhere. You can understand from a local perspective why this was a good idea. You can understand why a mayor or a governor would want to attract a good business, take a business from Wisconsin and create jobs here. I think that's Al Checky calling. Al Checky actually came after my job. He wanted me fired. So we argued that it was zero-sum, and then I went back to Mel and I said, okay, here's the economics. When it's private market, private businesses, that's Adam Smith. That's the invisible hand. Markets are generally efficient under certain conditions. But it's different when we're talking about governments and governments competing. There's the Thibault, which is the good competition when it's for public goods. But this preferential stuff is zero-sum. And from a national perspective, it's a zero. He's still calling. From a national perspective, it is a zero return. Now, the data I didn't have then, but the New York Times, years later, because people got to ask me how much money are cities and states wasting in these bidding wars. And New York Times, Louise Story is her name, she did a 3-part series that won some sort of awards. So she got the data by county, city and county data on their economic development divisions and how much money they were spending on this. She lowballed it and got $80 billion a year that cities and states are spending on these these economic bidding wars. So, so in some ways that's the research, if you will. That was our annual report. Out of that annual report, there's a lot of interest in this, and we ended up running so now we're starting to translate. And we ran a conference, National Academy of Science, Harvard Business School, and National Public Radio got involved. And Secretary of Labor was one of our keynote speakers. We had Alan Greenspan there. We had Alice Rivlin there. We had some pretty prominent people, and we ran this conference all on this issue. A year later, because Mel agreed with me that this looked like an interference with interstate commerce, we hosted a conference at the law school on federalism, specifically on this issue, and we brought some of the best constitutional lawyers in the country and asked them, is this a violation of the Commerce Clause? And it was pretty much unanimous that it was. So we're now getting out there, translating it, and finally, which kind of proud of this in some ways, even though it didn't go anywhere, there was a congressman from southern part of Minnesota named David Minge. And David Minge was a lawyer from Chicago, a very smart guy. He comes, visits us at the bank, and he buys this argument that there is something wrong with the rules that we've set up for these cities and states. And he wants us to consider writing a bill to introduce in Congress. All right, so think about this. What would you propose to end this economic bidding war? Suppose we all agree, zero-sum game, makes no sense to allow cities and states to do that. Congress has the authority to end this bidding war. So what would you propose? And a lot of people were writing to me saying, look, Rolnick, this is a states' rights issue. You can have the federal government come in here and examine the Viking Stadium and say what you can and can't do. So how would you fix this? So here was our proposal. Pretty simple. Our proposal, any private company that got a gift, a subsidy, corporate headquarters, outright subsidy, a stadium, whatever, under our bill, this was our proposal, it would be taxed. Right now there's a loophole that says if you, private company, you get some sort of a gift from a sub-government, you don't have to declare it as income. We close the loophole in this bill. And then we have the federal government tax it at 100%. Game over. The Vikings never would have come to the city and the state to ask for $500 million because anything they got from the city and the state, they'd have to give right over to the federal government. So pretty simple, and you know, it wouldn't require much of any sort of bureaucracy to regulate this thing, to oversee it, because it's sort of self-enforcing. We would require any private business who got the subsidy, they'd have to report it, and any sub-government would have to report it. So it would be pretty obvious. And so you really just, you know, you'd get rid of the incentive, totally get rid of the incentive to do this. And we wrote it, and we wrote the bill in such a way that we left some wiggle room. Preferential meant that it was at least for 1 or 2 or 3 businesses. But if it was over 4 or 5, whatever, we'll view that as a general one. But we thought we could get rid of most of the egregious subsidies, especially the sports subsidies or corporate headquarters, and that was a good percentage of the money that was being wasted. So now let's get to the real world. So we get Minge introduced this bill into the House. Paul Wellstone, the senator at the time, wanted to introduce it in the Senate with John McCain. And before they got to introduce it in the Senate, I get a call from Minge's office. The bill is dead. I said, Congressman Minge, what do you mean the bill is dead? The sports lobbyist killed it. They have a lot of money. They're politically very powerful. It never got a hearing. That was the end of it. So I remember there was a New York Times reporter who wrote a piece on this who said to me, you know, Rolnick, until Congress ends this thing, it's going to continue. I mean, the incentives are there. And it continues to this day. As you can look out your window and see that big, beautiful stadium. I happen to be friends with the Mortensons. They're the ones who built that stadium. And we don't talk about that stadium much. So we had the research. We translated it. I thought we did a pretty good job translating it. There's general agreement, especially in Minnesota. If you were to, both the Twin Stadium and the Viking Stadium, there's about 70% of the public who said there shouldn't be public funding for this. And be careful of this is economic snake oil. They talk about all the jobs it creates. I said to the governor, where did you get the $500 million from? That's not manna from heaven. You took it out of the economy. You took it from businesses that presumably would have invested or consumers that would have spent or whatever. So the notion that you created these jobs, and then they like to point to the construction jobs. Well, at that time, construction industry was fully employed, so they moved people from one construction job to another. The other ploy they use is they're going to hire people of color. And again, lots of ways that they play this game politically that sounds good, and the general public doesn't. They see people working there, so there must be jobs. So we had the research, as Walter suggested. You got to have the research. We did translate it well, but when you got into the political arena, and Walter never quite explained this to me, you got to be able to manage somehow the political waters, navigate the political waters, and that ain't easy because, as we know, there's a lot of self-interest, a lot of money to be made in the $80 billion. And so if we're just research people doing this, it's hard for us to lobby for what we'll call the right policy. Okay, so where are we on time? My third case study. And this is the one I'm most proud of because I think the research is overwhelming. I think we've done a pretty good job translating it, and we've actually been able to make some headway in the political system. So early education, early child, how does a guy at the Fed who's, actually my research is all on pre-Civil War banking, how the heck do I get involved in early childhood education? So for many years, there was a group of us, about 40 of us, that would meet in downtown Minneapolis. And these were lawyers and business people, et cetera, some media people. And we would meet and we invite somebody to make a presentation on whatever. And this is back in 2002, 03, lunch downtown here. A man by the name of Todd Otis was a former state representative. He was now heading an organization called Ready for K, Ready for Kindergarten. And this organization was founded with the help of former governor of the state of Minnesota, Al Quie, a Republican, and a former mayor of Minneapolis, Don Fraser, a Democrat. And the two of them had helped found this organization to promote investment in early childhood education. And I'm listening to Todd. He's giving this report. He's got these beautiful pictures of young kids in an early childhood setting. And I raised my hand at the end of his talk and I said, Todd, I don't think your arguments are going to go very far because you're basically making the moral argument. This is a good thing to do. It's a right thing to do. And I said, you know, there's lots of right things to do. It's a right thing to invest in K through 12. It's a right thing to invest in higher education. It's a right thing to reduce pollution, et cetera, et cetera. I said, my guess is politically you'll be much better off. This is the Walter Heller in me coming out. You'd be much better off if you did some economic research. And my guess is you might find some pretty good results. And as I tell people, that was my mistake. Because they didn't disagree with me. So now I got the governor calling me and the mayor calling me, and you don't say no to these guys, right? So I said, fine. I go back to the office, and I had a young colleague of mine who was running my economic education outreach guy, Rob Grunwald, and I figured he must know something about this. And I said, Rob, I've committed us to doing this work, but I said, don't worry about it. My guess is, you know, we'll go to the research out there, we'll summarize it, we'll do the white paper, hand it to Ready for K, we'll be done. That's what we did. And give it to Ready for K. I didn't know what they were going to do with it, but they started pushing it out. And within 6 months, I get invited to the National Governors Conference. Jeb Bush was the governor at the time in Florida, and I'm on this keynote speaker. I don't know, there were 100 governors and governor assistants and lieutenant governors and some attorneys or whatever at this conference. Well, all on early ed. A year later, at the guest of the president of Turkey, I'm in Istanbul with something like 400 delegates from the Middle East and Europe, and the Queen of Jordan was there. she walks in the room, you can't imagine. The press was going nuts. And what am I doing there? I'm the guy. What do I know? I mean, all right. So, and then, but my favorite was a name you might remember. Some of you, most of you are too young. Mike Milken. He was the junk bond king, made a fortune, a few $1 billion in the 70s and 80s. And he has started two foundations, one on cancer research and one on education. His company owns KinderCare, which is an international early childhood program, and his lawyer had heard me speak in Washington. So they invited me to Beverly Hills, California to speak on this issue, and they put me on a panel with Andre Agassi. Now, I'm a tennis player of sorts, and there's Andre. And I go in the speaker's room. He introduces himself to me. Are you kidding? And he starts asking me, why is what's a Fed guy doing here? So I said, wait a second, Andre, what is a tennis player doing here? Well, some of you may know this. He started a foundation, and he built a charter school for low-income Latino kids in Las Vegas. And so we had a great discussion, and he said, wait a second, Rolnick, and he brings over his CEO of his school and says, talk to Rolnick, we got to start an early ed program. All right, so what did we say? What did Rob and I say in this essay? No. He gave me his book, though. His book is a good read. So what did we say in this essay that got all this attention? So there are a number of longitudinal studies. I'm going to just mention Perry Preschool, but there's 3 other ones. The Perry Preschool was 1963, Ypsilanti, Michigan, 123 at-risk families, randomly divided them up into 2 groups. So the methodology doesn't get any better. We could never do this at the Fed. We were never allowed to experiment with the economy to see what we would get. Chari always wanted to do that. I said, no, Chari, we can't. So I'm seeing a randomized control. So now you can really talk about causality. I mean, how many, you know how difficult it is to talk about causality, to prove causality. Well, here we have a randomized control, Perry Preschool, early 60s. They take 123 families, randomly divide them into 2 groups. One group is the control group. They're left alone. The other group gets high-quality preschool. So these are 3- and 4-year-olds. They're small classroom size, master-level teachers, and a lot of home visits, working with the parent. I want to stress that. And they start collecting data on these kids. They collect data, 10 years worth of data to see how they do in the 3rd grade, 20, 30. Rob and I had the 30 years data set. Actually, Perry Preschool was viewed as a failure after the 10-year data set came out because the IQ of the kids in the program went up, and then by the 3rd grade, they were very close to the control group. So you'll hear a lot in this field about fade out, and that's often what they point to, Perry Preschool fade out. But now go out 30 years and 40 years as well, and you find that the kids that were in the program were less likely to need special ed, were less likely to be retained in a grade, were more likely to be literate by the 6th grade, graduate high school, get a job, pay taxes, stay off welfare, and the crime rate between the 2 groups goes down 50%. So we asked a simple question that most economists and business people would ask. What was the return on that investment? Now, in today's dollars, it was roughly $10,000 per year, so it was a $20,000 investment. So we had that data, and we had all the benefits, and we had dollar values, and there's a lot of good research done on the value of crime or reducing crime. So we had that data, and we simply took that data, and there was already benefit-cost ratios of like 7 to 1. Sounded huge to me, 7 to 1. But I said to Rob, here's a problem with these benefit-cost ratios. What's the benefit-cost ratio of building another stadium? What's the benefit-cost ratio of a scholarship to the University of Minnesota for a low-income kid? We don't have that. So I said, let's take that data and compute in the internal rate of return. I figured if we got an internal, we can start comparing it to things. And so the comparison was going to be to the economy. What's the economy? This is Heckman's number. James Heckman uses the number post-World War II. The annual rate of return on the stock market is 5.8% inflation adjusted. I assume he's got it right. So that was our hurdle. If we can beat 8%, I can go back to the state or go back to Quee and the governor and the mayor and say, look, we can get a 6.5%, 7% return. We got a good investment here. We can make the argument, and we can take the money out of the economy and beat what you can get in the economy. That was a simple idea. So I'm looking to beat. So I send Rob back. I said, put this through the compute the rate of return. He comes back a couple days later. And again, I'm looking for 7.5. I would have been pretty happy. 18% inflation adjusted return. I said, Rob, that's embarrassing. That's way too high. No one's going to believe that number. Go back and double check, and he does. Finally, I said, forget it. I took the data, I sent it to James Heckman, and Heckman was working on these studies at the same time. I said, Jim, would you do us a favor? We're getting this huge number. Would you check it for us? Took a couple months. He sends back a little cryptic note, which Heckman usually does, 18%. And as we're doing this, I'm realizing we're lowballing it. Why do I say that? Because we're finding out anecdotally, and later on I'll tell you more, that we're having effects on the parents. The parents that are getting mentoring, it's improving their lives. Many of them are going back to school, getting jobs. We're changing their health, actually, in a lot of ways. We couldn't document, we didn't have that data. We didn't have data on the siblings in the family. Odds are, if the parenting is getting better, the siblings are doing better. We didn't have the data on teacher productivity. If a lot of these kids going together into a classroom that are prepared and have engaged parents, teacher productivity, we know goes up. Much easier to teach to a class of engaged students. If you've ever taught in the inner city, you would know. So we didn't have that data. And finally, of course, we didn't have data on the children of the children, obviously. So if we're making headway with these kids and they end up being more successful in life and starting families and making more income, odds are their kids are going to do better. That data we didn't have. Finally, probably the biggest thing we're missing, and Heckman has gone back and looked at one of these longitudinal studies and started to see some real progress on health metrics. So this was a study out of North Carolina where they started with the kids at birth, and he got the data on adults' health metrics, and there was a control group. And sure enough, when he looked at heart disease, it was down significantly for the kids who had gone through this program. Okay, so that was the research. That was the bottom line, and that's got all this attention, this high rate of return. And that's cited all the time now, which is very flattering, but there is this question. How do you take that research, again, translate it, and take it to the real world? So we had a second proposal, and it was influenced heavily by a man by the name of Jack Shunkoff, who was at Brandeis. He was a dean at Brandeis at the time. He's now at Harvard. He runs this institute on neuroscience. And Heckman told me to go see this guy. He says, you've got to learn about the neuroscience of brain development. I didn't know what Heckman was talking about, but Jack Shunkoff got a hold of me and said, look, Rolnick, I know you're looking at the preschool 3- and 4-year-olds. For the most at-risk kids, the kids you care about the most, it's too late. I said, what do you mean too late? Well, it turns out what the neuroscientists have found that a high percentage of your brain is developed between the actually prenatal to 3. The numbers are fuzzy, but say 80%. It's a high percentage, and if a child's in a stressful environment, I want you to equate poverty and stress, that brain doesn't develop right. Neglect is the biggest problem. So the extreme example is the Romanian orphans, which you may remember, these orphans had very little interaction with their parents. Well, excuse me, not with their parents, with adults who were taking care of them. It was just at feeding time. So it was extreme neglect. So they did brain imaging of these kids. These brains were a third smaller at age 3. So now, and they've learned much more about, since the Romanian experiment, there's a whole lot of literature on how the brain develops or doesn't develop under stress. They call it toxic stress. And again, it can be just the pressure on the parents living in poverty that somehow that child picks up in that brain. It could be neglect, just not interacting with that child makes such a huge, we take a lot of this for granted. But I've gone on some home visits in these families, and usually you'll find a teenage mom, no father around, and the child, the 6-month-old, is in front of a TV for most of the day. So given that neuroscience research, given these longitudinal studies, overwhelming that we've underinvested in our most vulnerable kids. We call them our high-return kids now. So we made a proposal, given Jack, and Jack challenged me. He knew we were going to do this second policy paper on how to bring it to the real world. So we had a very simple idea again. Early learning scholarships. All right? Very simple. We just give the scholarship to the parent, and let the parent pick a high-quality program. Has to be high quality, and that's it. Pretty simple. All sorts of great programs out there. The scholarships included funding for home visiting nurses. One study I didn't mention by David Olds out of Columbia, I believe. He did the study with home visiting nurses starting prenatal, and he got these incredible results. So we combine the home visiting program with the scholarship, so it's prenatal to 5. The mentoring goes on at prenatal. More likely the child's born full weight, full term. And his study shows they have fewer kids. Parents do really better. So that was a complete program. And then we said, so think of it as early learning scholarship / mentors. And I was very fortunate, a man by the name of Warren Staley heard me speak. Warren Staley was the CEO of Cargill at the time. Cargill is one of the most successful private corporations in the world. And his foundation was putting money into preteens and vulnerable preteens, and he said, Art, I'm not getting anything out of that. He said, what you're proposing sounds good. He says, but let's get you out of the ivory tower there at the Federal Reserve, and let's put you in the real world. And here's what he proposes. We're going to create a nonprofit. It's called the Minnesota Early Learning Foundation, MELF. And we're going to raise a bunch of money, and we're going to see if it really works. We can implement it. So, okay, Warren, if he says he's going to do that. Now, Warren, needless to say, is very well connected, so he creates this board of directors. So who does he ask on the board? His buddies? CEO of General Mills, Ken Powell, the CEO of Ecolab, Doug Baker, Bob Brunick, who was president of the University of Minnesota, a man by the name of Charlie Weaver, who was Governor Palente's former chief of staff, who runs a business organization, the Minnesota Business Partnership, which is like 120 major companies in the state. Mike Cerisi, one of the top lawyers in the country. It was a very distinguished, mostly business-oriented board, and we did something very simple in a way. They raised $20 million. You ask, how do you raise $20 million in a short period of time? Well, in our first board meeting, Warren Staley said, Cargill's in for $5 million. What are you guys in for? And that worked pretty well. And what did we do with the $20 million? The first, roughly half of it went creating a rating system. We call it Parent Aware. It's a 4-star rating system. Because our scholarships, the parents have to use it at a quality rated program. And then the other half went to circling. Well, some of it went for research, because we had an evaluator come to evaluate the program. But a good chunk of it went to a community. We circled a community in St. Paul known as Frogtown, very low-income neighborhood in St. Paul. We chose St. Paul because the mayor of St. Paul got wind of this, and he offered up his staff to help us implement this. Because we're like a startup company, right? And so we had to go knock on doors. And fortunately, we went knocking on doors with the mayor, with some faith-based leaders, et cetera. So we looked legitimate. We weren't going to take the kids away from them, right? Believe me, we weren't. And so eventually it worked. Eventually we ran out of money. We gave out 650 of these early learning scholarships. And then the critics started to come out. And what did the critics say? Well, this isn't going to work for a number of reasons. It's not going to work because these parents, now these are people that had clearly been jaded and working in this field for a long time. So the parents are so disengaged they won't use the scholarships. Virtually every parent used the scholarship. And then they said, and it's going to be tainted because it's going to be viewed as welfare, and these kids are going to be marked. I said, when you get a scholarship to go to the University of Minnesota, to Harvard, is that a bad thing for the parent? I don't think so. And we did focus groups with our parents, and they couldn't believe somebody cared that much about their child, they would give them a scholarship. So it was just the opposite. And then my favorite was, well, wait a second, Rolnick. If you go to Frogtown, they don't have any 4-star rated programs there. They won't have any place to go. I said, well, markets tend to work. Once the market finds out that we're going to have 650 families, and we were paying up to $13,000 a year, because we were trying to incentivize, obviously, some supply-side response. So within 6 months, if you go just north of the Capitol on Rice Street, New Horizon opened up a brand new facility in Frogtown, a little outside of Frogtown, on a bus line. Within a short period of time, they filled up with scholarship kids because they could pay. Montessori expanded their programs. Public school expanded their programs, and a bunch of faith-based organizations expanded theirs. So virtually within 6 months, every parent found a high-quality program to go to. We brought in outside evaluator from California, formerly known as Stanford Research Institute, SRI, do the evaluation. We didn't have a randomized control. We definitely had some selection bias there. Nevertheless, we got some very, very encouraging numbers. In fact, they were so encouraging, and I fortunately in '08 had a dinner with a man called Rahm Emanuel, who I'll show you how naive he was. I didn't know who he was. He was running Obama's campaign at the time. But anyways, his brother had met me and asked if I'd sit down with Zeke I met, and this was Rahm, who was a congressman, and he said he'd be interested, and then he said, okay, what should the federal government do? And I said, put some money into Race to the Top, so states could bid on that money who had innovative ideas. And he did that, and a couple years later, we got a $45 million Race to the Top grant here in the state to replicate what we did in St. Paul. So as we're speaking, we're replicating it, we're continuing in St. Paul, replicating it in North Minneapolis, on White Earth Reservation, and in Itasca County. And to my critics, I point out in every one, we call them transformation zone, in every one we have waiting lists. The word is out that these scholarships are available. And let me tell you, we bring the parents in who've received these scholarships to testify, because 2 years later, we pushed the state to start adding some significant funding. And I'm going to tell you one story because it kind of brings it home, but we ended up getting $60 million for the next 4 years, and that's roughly 10% of our kids. In the next session, we're hoping to double down to get it to 20%, ultimately to get the state to commit $350 million a year, so every child born into poverty in this state would have this opportunity. I want to conclude, before I conclude with this story, which meant a lot to me. So you'd think, I did what Heller said, right? We had the research, it was kind of overwhelming. We did a great job, I think, translating it. We did a survey across the state. Should the state invest in a stadium or in these kids? It was 70, 80%, the kids first. And it should be targeted on the most at risk. There's very little return after that. I quote Heckman as saying, for upper middle class kids, it's a waste of money. The research is all about our vulnerable kids. Okay, they're the ones who end up in jail if they don't graduate high school. They're the ones that get into trouble. It's not the middle class kids. So I thought naively this would be fairly easy. Now, and I remember sitting down early on when I had this proposal with Governor Pawlenty. And Pawlenty actually knew the neuroscience research, and he said to me, Rolnick, looks fine, but you're not going anywhere with this. I said, what do you mean? The teachers' union is going to cut you off at the knees. I didn't believe him. I said, come on, we're going to have the research, we're going to show them, that's it. So this is where the headwinds come. This is the pushback. So I've been at this for, 12, 13, 14 years, pushing early childhood education as a great investment. Why should an economist from the Fed be leading this charge? Shouldn't it be the public schools? They're the ones who are getting blamed for the achievement gap. We got the largest achievement gap in the country in this state. You would think the schools would say, it's not our fault, you've got to start early. The research is there. It took over a decade for them finally to say, yes, early childhood is important. We got to do something. And what's their proposal? They want to add a grade, age 4, onto the public schools. That's it. They need $400 million a year to do this for all 4-year-olds. We need $350 million a year to do this for all poverty kids. And what they don't tell you, it's in the fine print, is because they're making it public school only, they need $2 billion in infrastructure. Because they don't have the classroom size. I actually have the superintendents on my side on this thing because they say we can't do this. It's going to take us years to develop this. So no, our program, we take advantage of the market, mixed delivery. Our parents get to choose Montessori or whatever. But that's where the pushback is coming. And when I press them on this, I said, show me the research. Show me any research. I'm playing Walter Heller now, right? I'm using Walter Heller. Show me the research that we should be public school only, 4-year-old. We know it's too late. We know all the, so you lose there, public school only. And then I ask them, this is pretty telling, where do you send your kids? So your kid goes to Montessori, and you're telling the low-income families they have to go to the public schools? And yours is so much more expensive, doesn't it? You're wasting a whole lot of money. All right, so that's the pushback. And you would think with all the support we had, all the data, we have the business community behind us, we have most of the leaders, community leaders of color have supported this. But the teachers union has 77,000 members. This is what Heller never told me. Never told me there was going to be a teachers union out there with 77,000 members that have a lot of money. We don't have any money. The Fed has a lot of money, but I'm not with the Fed anymore. But we don't have, we do have a lobbying group now through United Way. We have a group called Mini Minds. You can go online and we do lobby. But we don't have any money. We don't really fund individual politicians. So the governor, when I meet with the governor, and he did give us $60 million for fortunately, working with both sides of the aisle, we got that $60 million. And when I sit down with the governor privately, he agrees with me. He absolutely agrees with me. But publicly, he's pushing the Universal 4. Why? So again, Helen never told me this. They want Tina Smith, the lieutenant governor, to be the next governor of the state. And if you're a Democrat in this state, you don't become governor if you don't have the teachers union on your side. So publicly, he's coming out for Universal 4, and that is the battle. Okay. I think it's 50-50 whether we win, despite all this research. And we just got a study out of Tennessee. Tennessee has a 4-year public school-only program, and they're not closing the achievement gap. They're getting very little out of it. They're spending a lot of money. So we already got an experiment where we show this doesn't work. And then I started mentioning Perry. One of the lessons from Perry is if you don't get the parent and the mom in particular engaged in this and empowered, we're not going to get these kind of returns. Actually, best predictor of a child's success is a mother's education. So let me just finish with, and then open it up for questions, with an anecdote, a story of one of our parents who got these scholarships. I use it on the governor, but so there's an organization out in Wayzata, Plymouth area. And that area is a fairly well-to-do area, but they cornered me a number of years ago and said, Rolnick, we've got a lot of poverty families out here. What should we do? And I said, well, take a look at the scholarship program. And they did that. And it's been running for 10 years now. And they raise all this money privately. And they give their families in this school district, low-income families, early learning scholarships for 2 years. And they run a fundraiser at the Wayzata Country Club. 300 people show up there, and they get Chaz Anderson, he's the superintendent of the Wayzata schools, to moderate this thing. So about 6 years ago, they bring up one of the parents who got the scholarships. This is a parent who fought in Iraq. Okay, she comes back to this country. She is single parent with a 2- and a 3-year-old, very depressed. Her kids are not doing well. And her minister said, you ought to apply for the scholarship. And she did. And she tells us her story, and she brings her kids up, and their kids now have these beautiful paintings, and they're doing great. And she was able to go back to school. She's engaged, and she just got a new job. Well, she had most of us in tears at the time. And needless to tell you, they raised a lot of money for these scholarships. So that's the Heller legacy in some ways. If you want to make a difference, you need the research. You need to translate it. It ain't going to go anywhere if you don't translate it. And then you got to get into the political system. And that's the tough. I used to think, boy, the research is really tough, and it is. To do it right and get something that's convincing is not easy. Translating it isn't easy. But there's still another major step. And I could tell when we did the Too Big to Fail, we were Minnesota nice, and we shouldn't have been Minnesota nice. On this issue, I'm not being Minnesota nice anymore. It's unconscionable, given this research, that we're not giving these kids this opportunity. So thanks for the opportunity to speak, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
So how does the politics change now after the election?
He doesn't need me speaking that. So actually, I'm not going to comment on the national level, but at the local level, it actually moved in favor of our proposal. Because before the election, the House, Minnesota House was Republican, and the Senate were Democrats. So The Democrats in the House were, most of them, not all of them, but many of them were tied to the teachers union, and they were pushing the governor's proposal. And we were concerned that if the House went Democrat, that now the governor would easily get his $2 billion plus whatever. And we would be shut out. And the danger, by the way, if that had happened, and we didn't get results, which we probably wouldn't have, the critics would say, see, this early childhood stuff doesn't work, and we would just totally lose. And we were not going to get much for prenatal to 3. Another point that I didn't mention on the prenatal to 3, on the White Earth Reservation, half the children last year were born addicted. So I say to the public schools, you think you're going to close that gap at 4? You've got to get to these parents early. So the political situation actually, I think, because both the House and the Senate now are Republican, I think the governor is going to have to compromise, which privately I think he wants to do anyway. And what we're going to ask for is double down from the 60 million, get to 120 million, with a commitment to ultimately bring it to scale. So we'd like to get the out years up, but double down with a commitment for fully funding this. And what a great message, especially in this political environment, to tell all our low-income children, our poverty children, especially our children of color, that so we're going to make this happen and we're going to fund it.